Hello, I'm James Burgess. I want to talk to you about my spiritual practices. Any seeker wants to understand something. That's why they're seeking. They want to understand perhaps the meaning of life, or they want to understand the best way to behave, or they want to understand how to deal with problems that they have on the psychological or the physical actual level. Various reasons why we are seekers. And this first understanding of why you're doing it is very important. Why are you a spiritual seeker? Are you a spiritual seeker? Or are you somebody who's just interested, who's looking around, discussing philosophies, trying to get a sense of what's going on? The first real decision is to cross that line and to say, yes, I am a seeker. I'm looking for answers. Now, looking for answers requires us to first look for questions. Our quest is the enactment of questions. This is not just clever. This is profoundly wise. The idea that we have to learn how to ask a question is very subtle and meaningful. I would say people do not ask the right question, and therefore the answers that they get don't scratch the itch of their curiosity and longing for knowledge. The first thing to do, therefore, is to know what is the question that you're asking. So, what is a spiritual seeker? What is a seeker? What is spiritual? These are very important questions, and if you don't look at them at the beginning, then you're going to have to look at them before the end, because you won't get very far until you know what you mean. What does spiritual mean? What is spirit? I'm not going to give you answers. I'm just suggesting that you might want to ask yourself that question. For you, what does the word spiritual mean? And for you, what does the word seeker mean? Are you seeking? Are you giving as much attention to your spiritual seeking as you are your material world journey? I would say that to become quite successful in life, as a material world sense, you'd need to study and practice and to learn a skill, to train, to be taught, to make mistakes, to be corrected, to have an employer. You'd need to go through quite a process. And typically somebody who's a doctor or an architect or a nurse or a dentist, they take exams. They might study for 5 years or more, and they might join a professional organization. And that's what they do in order to find their life path as a career in a material world sense. If you're going to take your spiritual journey as seriously, there's a clue to the kind of things that you might need to do. You might need to study seriously for a very long time. You might accept that certain things that occur in life are examinations. You might find yourself exposed to different teachings and different teachers and different influences. All of this is really a requirement if you're committed to being a spiritual seeker. In my case, I have found a lot of very useful guidance has come from the study of music, both playing a guitar, for example, and learning how to sing, and dancing also. To do these things with a certain intention to raise your sense of spiritual awareness. Music is very helpful indeed, really helpful. I'm following more than anyone else the teachings of Hazrat Inayat Khan. He's a Sufi teacher from northern India. He came to the West about 100 years ago and has created a following. It's still very active today, and most of my specific teachings have come from that field of Sufism. So I'll talk in some way around Sufism now. This has not been the only thing which has moved me spiritually. I've had some influence from the Christian tradition also, some influence from earth-based religions, paganism, and so on, and I've met Wiccan practitioners, and that has been influential. So I've had I've been exposed to various teachers and teachings, and found a package of teachings that for me work. And I think this is the modern way, this is the 21st century way of approaching our spiritual journey, to find what works for us, having choice between various teachings. Now, we can align with one teacher from the beginning to the end, and that is most assuredly one path. It just may not suit most of us. It's a bit too disciplined in today's world. The old way of doing things was so different. You would simply join one teacher, one teaching, and you'd stay there for a lifetime. That would be all that you'd get. You'd only have one set of ideas presented to you. You'd have right and wrong explained to you. I find all of that religious attitude to spirituality too restrictive for my personality. So, like many people of today's age, I have widened my horizons of interest and looked into different ideas from different religions. So Sufism, it's not a religion really. It's associated with Islam traditionally, but I'm not Muslim, and the Sufism that I'm studying has been changed quite a lot by its exposure to the Western approach. It's based on 4 types of practice, and they can be labeled as sound, breath, light, and consciousness. Sound practices would be called mantra in some other fields, and in Sufism they divide between 2 types, the practice of Zikr and the practice of wazifa. A Zikr is a repetitive phrase which is based on the idea of worship. La ilaha illallah is the most commonplace one. There is no God but God. It's not so much the intellectual understanding of the words that holds the wisdom, though. There's always an onomatopoeic aspect of these practices. That means the word itself sounds like the meaning, or you can infer what a practice means by noticing how it feels when you say it. So these practices come from the mantric language of Arabic. Only 4 mantric languages exist. Apart from Arabic, there's Aramaic, there's Hebrew, and there's Sanskrit. These are the 4 mantric languages. And Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic are all very closely linked linguistically. So the Arabic language and the Aramaic language very often share words, and you can sometimes see them in Hebrew as well. When we speak one of these mantric languages, the way in which it's said is as important, perhaps more important, than the intention you have in the meaning. So all of the practices in the sound practices within Sufism have this quality of being able to feel them. And so actually these sound practices are only spoken, are only turned into sound at the beginning so that you know how to remember the sound. So the more subtle practice itself is spoken in silence. You can't hear it. You can think it, you can feel it, and then you can actually go beyond that to a higher level. So the sound practices are very strong in Sufism. The Zikr practices are the highest, and they return you to a state of remembrance of yourself as soul, so that you have a knowledge of God which is somatic. In other words, it's a body knowledge. You can feel yourself to be in this heightened state of being. The wazifa practices are qualities. They're called angles of God or angels of God sometimes, or more traditionally the beautiful names of God. And so you would say particular wazifas in order to develop certain qualities or to repair certain imperfections of personality or to tune in to certain essential aspects of the one. And wazifas are studied by repeating them for a while. Most often they're said in pairs. Sometimes they're said in triplicities. It's not recommended to say them individually for very long. They're powerful. All of these practices are powerful. If they're said properly, they're powerful, and therefore they're dangerous. This must not be taken lightly. It's tempting just to try out whether you can do the practice and have an effect, just to see if you're doing it right. And that shows a lack of faith. We need to develop faith as a part of our spiritual power, and this is not recommended to test a practice. You have to trust it and look for evidence in the longer term, not the short term. You have to dedicate yourself to this work and serve it, not expect a result from it. That would be an exchange, not a gift. So these wazifa practices are powerful, and you must be careful. Usually when you do these practices, you do them in a quiet space, often alone, sometimes with a group of people doing them together, and there's a sacred atmosphere. There's a sense of taking care to do this properly and guarding against intrusion, guarding against the intrusion of your thoughts into the process. If you can do that, then they're not dangerous, they're safe. But if you can't do that, then, well, you need to be around somebody that can just advise you that you need some guidance here. Breath practices are central to Sufism. We need to learn how to breathe differently. And the most obvious thing to do is to learn how to breathe slowly and deeply. It's quite unreasonable to think that you can develop spiritually until you've learned to control the breath. The breath is central. It centers you into a different place of being where you can make your decisions unemotionally. We still have feelings. Just because we learn to control them does not mean we don't have them. But we still have the understanding that if we cannot control the emotions, then the emotions will control us, and we become slave to passion and anxiety and judgmentalism and unreasonableness and so on. And the idea of being slave to anything is absolutely against the idea of a seeker at all. We're seeking to be free of all of that. We can't understand God and the nature of life and the meaning within it unless we're free of all the false stories we've been told for so long by so many. So we cannot be slave to our emotions and be true to our spiritual nature. The third aspect of Sufi practices would be called light practices. Usually this means visualization. Sometimes we mean physical light. We can train ourselves to see differently by looking at the sun. This has to be done very carefully indeed at certain times of the day. There's certain defensive practices and so on to stop our eyes being burned by the experience. But to train yourself to be able to look at the sun is important on some level. And also, we can look at other people in a certain way that has an effect upon them, and we can guard ourselves from the way that they're looking at us. These are all light practices. It's to do with how you process what comes into your eyes. And the idea of visualization is central to Sufism also. The idea of creating a program for the future, what's going to happen. You can start that off by learning the visualization process. One thing we do is to visualize the movement of energy. Energy is pretty much equated to light. We visualize the movement of energy as though it were light, and we can internalize that, so we can visualize shifts of energy within our body that has the eventual effect of moving stuff within us. When we have experiences that we don't enjoy as children, we hold them in the body. Our emotional nature is held in the physical body, and this can be dealt with in some way by visualization. So the process of studying light has to do with not only clearing old patterns of behavior and emotional issues, but also creating templates for what the future might unfold to become. Very often the sound practices and the light practices are linked together. So we would say a particular wazifa with a particular visualization, and this deepens the effect. The fourth practice within Sufism is consciousness. These are wisdom teachings, really. It is helping us understand the way to think. The way we think projects into life and shapes our life experiences. How we think, so we are. And therefore, to train the mind is a requirement if we want to influence our behavior. And we train the mind to think in faith, to think positively, to think optimistically, and to understand what's going on when we see a situation. So our perceptual capacity shifts as a result of these exercises. We perceive going on underneath the surface of things. You see two people interacting, they might think they're talking about the weather. You can see that they're actually forming a bond of friendship. You can actually notice their body language shifting according to this dance that they do, even though the conversation says nothing about what's going on. The physical body does, and you'll notice that, and you'll understand what's happening. You can see conflict arising between people in the same way. A certain word is spoken, and you see a reaction in one of the bodies, and you can notice that conflict has just started. You can interpret group behavior. You can interpret who is the leader of the group, who is the subtle, behind-the-scenes mechanic who makes things work. You can see who's the scapegoat. You can see who's the mama figure and who's the papa, and who's the wise man and who's the fool. And you can see all of this immediately when you see a group. So you shift your perception so that you're looking for this stuff. If you look, you'll see it more clearly, and if you don't look, you won't see it at all. In every scenario you come across, there's a dynamic. If you understand that dynamic better than the others in the group, then you tend to have the freedom of the group. You may not understand all that there is to understand, but even if you have some insight, you probably have more than most people. The one-eyed man is king in the kingdom of the blind. So when we discuss the teachings of consciousness, what that means is learning what's going on, learning that everyone has an emotional process, learning that mostly their emotional issues are of a certain small type, a small range. There are very few things that actually motivate people, very few indeed. So there's not much to look for, and you can pretty quickly understand what's motivating that person at this time. And you can see whether a person is consistent, whether they say what they do. And if somebody says one thing and does another, you'll just notice that. And you'll take that into account when you're dealing with them. If you listen carefully to the way somebody chooses their words, you can understand how they think. A lot of people will say the word you when they mean I. You often feel cold when it's raining, don't you? They don't mean you. They mean I feel cold because it's raining at the moment. And so on. So very few people speak properly. And if you can listen to how they speak and notice the difference between that and actually what makes sense, you'll notice their pattern of repressed emotion. And so you can help them if you have that in mind, or you can avoid them if you have that in mind. So these 4 types of practices, sound, breath, light and consciousness, form the basis, the essence of Sufism. But the single most important aspect of Sufism is adab. A-D-A-B, adab. It means something that we cannot really translate into our vernacular language. It's a mantric concept. It's hinting at the sacredness of respect. We have to learn, all of us, we have to learn to treat each other with respect that borders on or expresses your spiritual sense of sacredness, and require people to be like that with you too. Showing respect and requiring respect sets the foundation for healthy, meaningful and helpful interactions between people. Sufism also studies the elements, the 4 elements, earth, air, fire and water, all of which come out of the 5th, ether, and return to the 5th, ether. Ether is a name that just means, shall we call it, the atmosphere of reality, life itself. And if you have mastered practices within Sufism, and in fact this applies to every spiritual tradition that I've studied, there are practices, and if you master them, you get to know things, pretty much the things I'm talking about. So it's not only Sufism I'm talking about, it's any choice of serious spiritual practice. And if you get to master these practices, then you change who you are and how you are and what you are, and the influence you have increases. You bring a sense of balance to situations, and this is the ether. If you can enter a situation and identify it as too fiery, dangerous, too earthy, boring and life-denying, too airy, too much in the mind, too watery, too emotional, and balances between these elements, what is necessary for optimum enjoyment of an experience, the likeliest movement towards collective joy, is the element of ether. And a true Sufi would be able to bring that quality of ether into every situation they encounter. And it's perhaps the path of Sufism to walk in that sense of bringing balance to things so that joy can bubble up.